welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I look at what's making headlines here in Western Australia by reading through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, the West Australian. First up this week, Gate Overreaction, 7th of January 2015. Could I suggest that Subiaco Mayor Heather Henderson has a look around Australia and the rest of the world before declaring the damage to Patterson Stadium gates a real tragedy for football? It doesn't take much to see what constitutes a real tragedy, considering what is happening all around us. And as for the assumption that the damage was a blow to the whole of Perth, how does she assume that on behalf of the population of Perth? It seems to me to be a total overreaction to an unfortunate accident which caused no harm to anyone, only some limestone-clad gates which presumably can be repaired. Sue Benny, Peppermint Grove. The backstory is the one major football stadium, oval stadium here in Perth is Patterson Stadium, which is the sponsorship. It's generally known as Subiaco Oval, and there is an old historic limestone gate, sort of gatehousey kind of thing, which is not part of, which has historically been there anyway and being preserved. And here in WA, we don't really have many historic buildings. The history of Western Australia is only about 150 years old, so we don't have the kind of history they have elsewhere. So things like this are taken fairly seriously. So when they did redevelop the whole stadium, they kept the existing gate. And a allegedly drunk driver, crashed into it recently and caused a whole pile of damage. The mayor of Subiaco, in which the stadium resides, Heather Henderson, was asked for comment, and she described it as, they say, a real tragedy for football and a blow to the whole of Perth. One, this is mild hyperbole that we expect from politicians. Yes, they take these things seriously, probably perhaps more seriously than the average person, but this isn't some kind of crazy... She's not suggesting that... There was no hint in what she said that she thought this was worse than, the genocide in Rwanda or, the actions of ISIS in the Middle East. What she was saying is that, and in fact there were some other quotes from her, is that WA history is bound up, or white history at least, is bound up in football, and that these gates were a sort of a symbol of that, and that people, would feel it was sort of a blow to the footballing history of Western Australia. And given the high level of interest in football here in Perth, I don't think it's that crazy to say that it was a blow to the whole of Perth, rather than just a blow to Subiaco. I don't think she was suggesting that it was the entire population of Perth who were hurt by this, but certainly that a lot of people across all of Perth would be concerned by it, and I think that's a fairly reasonable statement. The other thing I hate about this, though, is that it rests on the similar fallacy that is used in a lot of other contexts. That is, that you shouldn't complain about something as long as there is something worse going on. And this is commonly used. When atheists complain about, Ten Commandments monuments in courthouses, say, Christians in America always say, don't you have better things to worry about? This is no big deal. Shouldn't you get over it? In fact, a lot of atheists would say that as well. Shouldn't we be fighting the real battles? And they miss the point that we can do both. Yes, sometimes maybe our resources are diverted into tackling an issue that might not be, shouldn't really be at top of the agenda. But generally speaking, we can care about all of these issues, and we can fight all of these issues. And the idea that we shouldn't care about damage to these gates because there are atrocities being committed in Paris is simply stupid. We can care about both. And in fact, we've probably got more control over and can respond better to damage to the gates than we can to plenty of other things. And it's not like... Yeah, and so that fallacy really pisses me off. I think as long as you're not making out that this issue is bigger than it really is, which I don't think the mayor was here, and as long as you're not suggesting diverting resources away from more deserving things, there is no problem with caring about small issues as well as big issues. And any attempt to kind of say, well, you shouldn't, is usually just a way of deflecting attention away from that issue, rather than a genuinely good faith attempt to get you to realign your priorities. Islamic agenda is alien to Australia, 9th of January 2015. The Paris atrocity is evidence the Islamic industry realises intimidation of the media is the best weapon to silence their critics. In recent years, the Australian media have gradually succumbed to the cancer of political correctness, which advances the Islamic agenda. Community criticism of alien cultures who abuse our welfare and legal systems, use halal certification for pseudo-religious commercial extortion, are hypersensitive to our own religious customs and food choices, and who show no signs of wanting to assimilate with and embrace Australian traditions is rarely published. Darryl Binning, Winthrop, says the guy who manages to get a letter published saying exactly this. And in fact, this is not an isolated letter. Every time something happens involving Muslims, letters like this come into the paper. There's, a couple a day. Anytime there's an issue about refugees, because the assumption is that refugees are Muslims, we get letters like this to the editor that get published. Now, what he is right in saying, though, is that there is a reluctance by mainstream media outlets to run stories that are explicitly like this. Now, some of the more tabloid newspapers and commercial stations do actually routinely run stories like this about Muslim welfare, cheats, doll bludging, terrorist, accomplice Muslim people, the war on Christmas. It's not quite as bad as it is in America, but there is certainly a segment of the Australian media which is quite happy to publish things like this, although usually not quite in as straightforward a tone as that. And partly because if they did say things as straightforwardly as this person did, they would clearly be shown to be wrong. All of the claims that he's making are basically wrong. There is no good evidence that this is how the majority of Muslim people behave in Australia. What there is are isolated incidents that the media can use to try and suggest that this is a widespread thing. And that's exactly what chunks of the media do. In fact, actually probably a broad chunk of the media, about half the media would probably fall into the category of happily running stories like that. The West Australian tends not to run too much like that these days. I'm not quite sure why, but I suspect it's because it's just factually wrong, and there just isn't any sort of basis for most of these stories. But you're right. I think there is one thing in here that I am concerned about and I agree with, and that is this, that we rely for our free speech generally actually on commercial businesses being willing to publish what we have to say. And in the wake of the acts of extremists, I can't call them the Islamic industry, I think that's stupid, but there are extremists who would kill people for publishing, cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. And in the wake of that, a lot of businesses have taken a fairly pragmatic and view of trying to be neutral in all of this. Things like YouTube, and will block a variety of things and just not, a lot of news organisations, so as to not cause offence or not to, upset people unnecessarily, will say, well, look, we won't publish, we support the right of Charlie Hebdo to publish this stuff, but we won't publish it. And the problem with that is that, yes, it does have a chilling effect. If every news organisation takes that approach and kind of goes, well, we support your right to free speech, but we're not going to publish these types of things, then what we end up is a de facto censorship where nobody is really willing to publish these things out of fear of offence. Now, I'm not sure there's a slippery slope between that and completely no criticism of Muslims at all, but it is a censoring of some free speech, which I would consider valuable. And so I do actually agree with the concern there that in the desire to be politically correct and not to offend people, there is the possibility that because we rely on businesses generally to be our free speech proxies, that we do lose some of that free speech. The internet helps, but I have a viewership of a couple of hundred, so it doesn't really matter all that much in the grand scheme of things what I say. I still have the freedom of speech in terms of the government not coming to get me, but it's far less a freedom of speech if the press won't publish it. Strap ban again, 12th of January 2015. So God has decided to take the initiative and ban corporal punishment in private schools, regardless of parents' wishes. Governments are elected to govern according to the wishes of the people, not according to some left-wing theory postulated by the likes of the late Dr. Benjamin Spock, whose theories have proved to be disastrous when put into practice. Governments have made such a disastrous mess of things simply by following the theories of high-achieving academics who have been totally devoid of a thing called common sense. Tom Edmonds, Gosnells. Okay, two things here. So the backstory to this is that the government here, who are right-wing conservative government, announced over Christmas that they were planning to formally ban the use of corporal punishment in all West Australian schools. So the current situation is that since about the mid-90s, there's been no corporal punishment in any public school. That's been banned. Before then, it was rarely used for at least another sort of 20 years before that. So mid-90s, it was completely banned. The Catholic schools voluntarily chose to stop using corporal punishment at that point. And the other non-Catholic private schools, which are all religious, also over the last 20 years or so, have decided to stop using it. And at the current moment, there is literally one school in the entirety of Western Australia who still has a policy of using corporal punishment, and that school has a total enrolment of 25 students. So in a state with 2.5 million people, there are literally 25 students who could possibly be subjected to corporal punishment. Now, any teacher will tell you that if they had a class of 25 students, they would expect to be able to manage it without using corporal punishment. If you have a school of 25 students, and they've got a headmaster and they've got several teachers, I shudder to think what kind of behavioural issues you think you're having where you need to use the strap. So the government's come out and said, look, there's only this one single school that is using the cane. Why don't we just ban it? Part of the reason behind this is that it's a no-brainer. The community sentiment is that caning has no role. There might have been some debate about it 20 years ago when it was first banned in all public schools, but even before then it was rarely used. Since then it hasn't been used, and there's been no great downfall in society. And so, this person who's suggesting that it is against the community wishes is completely off base. There is very little community support for it. In fact, there's only 25 people who are choosing to send their children to a school where they can get caned in the first place. And the other thing that I hate about this is this idea that we will not defer to the experts on parenting, that we will not accept what the experts say. Now, I'm not going to defend Dr. Benjamin Spock purely because I don't really know what he was on about and don't know anything about him. But psychology, child psychology, education, these are all fields that have knowledge. Experiments have been run, data has been gathered and analysed, results have been found. We understand as a society, we have knowledge in these areas. These are not just opinions of people. We know what works and what doesn't work. Now, we don't know it perfectly, but if, say, somebody said, these high achieving academics in physics who, claim that they can send a rocket to the moon, but, they just need to use some common sense, we would see these people as crackpots. But when somebody says this in the context of psychology, of children and education, somehow that's some kind of valid opinion. It's not. Society has not fallen off a cliff in the 60 or 70 years of moving away from punitive, disciplinarian type approach to children to a more, caring and compassionate sense. The way we approach children now is vastly different than back then, and society has not fallen off a cliff. If anything, we've gone from strength to strength. Crime rates have fallen dramatically. Across the board, living standards in Western societies have steadily risen. Some more than others, and some sections more than others. But generally speaking, there's no evidence to suggest that the way that we raise children now is a terrible, terrible thing and has these terrible impacts. Now, the only way I can imagine that this person can actually justify their opinions is because they're old and that they have nostalgia for a past that never was. Parental responsibility, 13th of January 2015. I wonder what the parents were doing when the young firebugs were setting fire to the bush recently. It would be too much to hope for recompense from the parents. After all, what can big grown-up adults possibly know what 8-year-olds are up to? Perhaps it might interfere with their TV watching. I think the parents should definitely be held accountable and perhaps be sued by those who have lost homes or possessions. Marion Stevens Hall's Head. So we had some deliberately lit bushfires recently. We've had many bushfires. Particularly, there was a deliberately lit one by 2 8-year-old children. And I think people lost homes as a result of it. And as always, when in these cases, 8 years old is younger than the age of criminal responsibility here, so these children cannot be held accountable for their actions because essentially they aren't responsible for their actions in a legal sense. And so, of course, people want justice. If you can't get justice from the children, then they get them from the parents. What this misses is a couple of things. First of all, there is this big push. People are constantly bemoaning nowadays that we don't let our children free range, that we don't give them the space to explore, we don't give them any kind of responsibility, that we mollycoddle them and wrap them in cotton wool and don't let them go outside, don't let them play unsupervised and manage every aspect of them. Now, I'm not suggesting that these kids necessarily they may well have been neglected and be lacking in parental responsibility, but I don't know. Has hardly been argued here. So we recognise that we should let kids essentially be kids by themselves to some extent, certainly more than we often do. part of that means that kids will light fires. There will always be some amount of fire lighting by young children. That's something that young children like to do. And as much as we are going to, responsibly supervise them, kids can be bastards. So some amount of this is already going to happen. To suggest that the parents are sitting at home watching TV is not founded in any evidence, and is founded only in the stereotype that that's what neglectful parents are doing, and that kids who light fires come from neglectful parents. That is a stereotype. It's not necessarily true. And the other thing is, I suspect that the law would support people suing if there was a legal case to be made there. That is, if the parents genuinely were neglectful of their children in a reckless and in a reckless manner, in a way that was clearly putting other people at risk, then I think the law would allow you to sue. The fact that people don't routinely sue the parents of children like this suggests to me that the parents aren't criminally responsible, aren't even civilly responsible. That, generally speaking, most parents don't just go, oh, look here, kids, have some matches and go off and, light some fire. Rather, they allow them to take sort of appropriate risks, and sometimes things go terribly wrong. As a society, I'm not sure that the shift should be to monitoring children all the time to the degree that we could prevent them from lighting fires. That sounds a bit too much like the kinds of societies that don't have the Western freedoms that I like. Lastly for this week, and you thought that I'd already covered the shootings in Paris and Muslims, but I haven't. There's another letter about them. Ban return of jihadis, 13th of January 2015. I'm in total agreement with both Sydney Smith and Wayne Tagg, letters 12th of January 2015, on the subject of Islam. How much more proof is required for our politicians to see that this so-called religion of peace will never assimilate with a country like ours? Anyone who is proved to be associated with terrorism and has an intention of visiting an Islamic country should have his Australian passport cancelled and banned from returning. Surely legislation can be drawn up to this end, but I fear it might be too late. Jess Scarborough. Okay, first up, Muslims have proven themselves capable of integrating into Australian society. I say this on the basis that Muslims were some of the first immigrants to Australia, along with with Europeans, so non-Aboriginal people, and have been here for the entire history of Australia. And yes, there has been some conflicts over the time, but essentially they've been here for as long as non-Muslims have, aside from the Aboriginal people. And on that basis, hard to say that they haven't integrated. I mean, they're here. They're just a small part of the population, and most people don't necessarily have direct contact with people who they know to be Muslims. Now, saying that they know, because Muslims aren't all Arabs, and they don't all wear burqas. And so there are, aside from the visible Muslims in the community, there are the not-so-visible Muslims. There are the Bosnians, for example, who are Europeans, and who are indistinguishable from, physically, from Croatians and Serbians, who are Christians. And so the Bosnians in Australian society are as Muslim as any other Muslim, but are completely invisible and have assimilated to the same degree as any other ethnic group. I have as many Muslim friends as I have Greek Orthodox friends. That is, I have one of each. And my Muslim friend is just as well integrated into Western Australia and society as my Greek Orthodox friend. And so it is quite possible for people who are Muslim to integrate into Western society. The real point here is that Islam is not a single monolithic religion that all Muslims follow in exactly the same way. The point is that there is a lot of variation amongst Muslims. There are a lot of different ways of being Muslim, and some of those ways are seemingly completely compatible with Western society, and Australia in particular. Many of the others are not. And so simply saying that Muslims cannot assimilate into this country or shouldn't be allowed to come here is to miss the point that plenty of Muslims can. I mean, case in point, in the Charlie Hebdo shootings, one of the police officers who was killed, one of the police officers who was specifically defending the free speech right, defending these journalists. His job was, he was part of the security detail to protect them, to protect their free speech rights. He was a Muslim. That is exactly the kind of Muslim, somebody who's willing to not only join the police force and fight for law and order and justice in society, but also to then be part of the security detail to protect the free speech rights of people who are critical of Islam. I mean, that's exactly what he was doing. This is the kind of person who I would want to have in this society, whether he's a Muslim or not. In the wake of this shooting, there's a Dutch mayor of, I think, Rotterdam, who is also a Muslim, and he came out and said, pretty much, if you want to live in the Netherlands, Holland, in the Netherlands, this is a free country. If you don't like it, piss off. And he said that to his fellow Muslims. That's exactly the kind of Muslim, somebody who would want to serve some kind of civic duty in the defence of freedom of speech and the freedoms that we enjoy in our countries. These are the kind of Muslims I would be happy to have in our society. And so to simply say Muslims no, I guess non-Muslims yes, or Christians yes, is to miss the point entirely, that we should be discriminating against people not based on what label they have on their religion, but rather what political beliefs these come with, what kind of, and not just political beliefs in a sort of vague sense, but whether these people support the kinds of democratic ideals that we have in this country. And if they do, you should be welcome to come here, and if you don't, you shouldn't be. And that is pretty much what our immigration system is based on. That's why we don't ban Muslims. We ban people, we don't let people in who are contrary to this way of life, as best we can handle it, as best we can manage it. But like all bureaucracies, like all systems in the real world, it is impossible to do that with 100% accuracy, and it's impossible also to predict what will happen to people. So some people will radicalise, and I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed, is about radicalisation and how to stop that. But the best way to stop that is not to simply stop Muslims from coming in, because some of the best defences against radicalisation is moderate Muslims. Anyway, that's it for this week. I'm feeling quite a bit better after having had a bit of a rant. I hope you're all doing well. It's bloody hot here. I hope everybody's enjoying the weather where you are. And I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.